In 1783, a man stepped off a ship in Bristol, England, returning from 19 years in the Caribbean. He brought with him a fortune of £70,000, the equivalent of more than £11 million today. He also brought two people, a freed mixed-race woman named Frances Coker and an enslaved man named Pero Jones. By the time John Pinney died in 1818, his wealth had grown fivefold to £340,000. His elegant townhouse at 7 Great George Street still stands in Bristol today, a museum showcasing Georgian splendor. But this is not just a story about wealth and architecture. It's about a man who justified human bondage through religion, who bought children as young as 12 to work his plantations, who built a fortune on sugar and suffering. It's about Pero Jones, who lived for 32 years as Pinney's enslaved servant in the heart of England. And it's about how that fortune began with a rebel's punishment, a story that starts not with John Pinney himself, but with his great-great-uncle's desperate gamble for survival. This is the story of John Pinney, and of the more than 900 enslaved people whose names we now know lived on his plantation. John Prater was born in Chard, Somerset, in 1740. His father, Michael Prater, died when John was just 4 years old. His mother, Alicia Clark, raised him until her own death in 1759, when John was 19. He wasn't born wealthy. He wasn't born a Pinney. He was an orphan with limited prospects, living in the West Country of England. But in 1762, at the age of 22, John Prater's life changed dramatically. His mother had a distant cousin named John Frederick Pinney, a wealthy man who owned land in Dorset and plantations on the Caribbean island of Nevis. John Frederick had no children. When he died, his will named young John Prater as the primary beneficiary. There was one condition. John Prater had to take the surname Pinney. John agreed. With the stroke of a pen, John Prater became John Prater Pinney, and with that new name came estates, land in England, and multiple plantations on Nevis, plantations worked by enslaved Africans. The inheritance also came with debt. The Nevis estates were run down. They had been neglected. But they represented opportunity for a young man willing to embrace the system that had generated the wealth. The fortune John Pinney inherited had a dark origin story. It began in 1685, during one of England's most turbulent periods. That year, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, the illegitimate son of Charles II, gathered a Protestant army to overthrow the Catholic King James II. The rebellion drew support from nonconformists across the West Country, people who rejected the established Church of England. Among those who joined Monmouth's rebellion was Azariah Pinney, a young man from Broadwindsor in Dorset. His father was Reverend John Pinney, a Presbyterian minister who had been ejected from his church during the Restoration. The Pinney family had established themselves through a thriving lace-making business, but Azariah felt compelled to fight. On July 6, 1685, Monmouth's army met the king's forces at Sedgemoor in Somerset. It was a disaster. 300 rebels and 200 royalists died on the battlefield. Another 1,000 rebels were killed as they fled. Monmouth himself was captured and beheaded. Azariah Pinney survived the battle but was arrested in London. He was sent to Dorchester for trial before Judge Jeffreys in what would become known as the Bloody Assizes. Nearly 200 people were condemned to death. About 800 were transported to the New World. Azariah was initially sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered at Bridport. But the Pinney family had resources. Azariah's sister Hester, a formidable businesswoman who would later become successful in the lace trade, paid a ransom of £65. It was an enormous sum, but it saved her brother's life. Instead of execution, Azariah's punishment was transportation. He was to be shipped to the West Indies and banned from returning to England for 15 years. His brother Nathaniel, a London merchant and member of the Royal African Company, an English trading company that dealt in enslaved Africans, arranged Azariah's passage. In late 1685, at the age of 24, Azariah Pinney sailed aboard the ship Rose Pink to the island of Nevis. He arrived in a place utterly foreign to him. Nevis was a small volcanic island in the Leeward Islands, dominated by sugar plantations. The economy ran on enslaved labor. White Europeans owned the land and controlled the production. Enslaved Africans did the backbreaking work that made sugar cultivation profitable. Azariah started as a factor, an agent for his brother Nathaniel, importing goods like lace from the family business to sell to plantation owners. He also bought produce, mainly sugar, to sell to English buyers. And he managed estates for absentee plantation owners who chose to live in Britain and run their properties through managers. But Azariah was ambitious. He began purchasing property. Eventually, his holdings combined with inherited estates to create Mountravers Plantation. The name came from Mount Travers, the rising land on the island. This would become the Pinney family's primary estate on Nevis. Azariah Pinney never returned to England. He married on Nevis and had a son, John Pinney, born in 1686. That son would continue building the plantation. When Azariah died around 1720, he had successfully transformed himself from a transported rebel into a wealthy plantation owner. His fortune was built on sugar and slavery. His original crime, rebellion against tyranny, had led him to become a tyrant himself, owning human beings and profiting from their forced labor. The plantation passed down through generations. By the time John Frederick Pinney inherited it, the estate was substantial but neglected. And when John Frederick died childless in 1762, it all went to his distant cousin's son, the young man who would become John Preter Pinney. In December 1764, John Pinney, now 24 years old, left England for Nevis. He had spent 2 years after his inheritance preparing, learning the business, understanding what awaited him. When he arrived on the island, he found the estates even more run down than he'd imagined. They were deep in debt. Many of the enslaved workers were old, sick, or too weak for the demanding work of sugar cultivation. Pinney made a calculated decision. He would sell some of these older, weaker enslaved people their freedom, on the condition they pay for it. This wasn't mercy, it was economics. As plantation owner, Pinney had to pay taxes on each enslaved person he owned. He also theoretically had responsibility for providing medical care, though most enslavers provided inadequate or no care. By treating these elderly workers as freed, Pinney avoided those costs and obligations. Then he bought new workers, young ones, strong ones, people he could season to the work. Seasoning was the brutal term for the process of forcing newly enslaved people to adapt to plantation labor and Caribbean conditions. It typically lasted 1 to 3 years. During seasoning, death rates were especially high. The combination of disease, malnutrition, harsh labor, and psychological trauma killed many who might have survived in different circumstances. Between January 1765 and July 1768, John Pinney purchased over 60 enslaved Africans. Most of them were children, Some were sold directly by slave ship captains. Others came through slave trading firms like Smith and Bailey's on the neighboring island of St. Kitts. Pinney's first purchase included 9 people. He later wrote about the experience to Harry Pouncey, a friend back in England. The letter, dated March 2, 1765, reveals his initial reaction and his rationalization. Since my arrival, I've purchased 9 Negro slaves at St. Kitts, and can assure you I was shocked at the first appearance of human flesh exposed to sale. But surely God ordained them for ye use and benefit of us. Otherwise his divine will would have been made manifest by some particular sign or token. This was John Pinney's moral framework. He experienced shock. He recognized the humanity of the people he was buying. But he immediately suppressed that recognition with religious justification. If God didn't want slavery, God would have given a sign. Since God hadn't given such a sign, slavery must be divinely ordained. It was a convenient theology. It allowed Pinney to acknowledge his initial revulsion while proceeding anyway. And proceed he did, systematically building up his plantation workforce. Among the children Pinney purchased in 1765 were 3 siblings, Piero, Nancy, and Sheba. They were bought along with 1 adult. The total price was £115, equivalent to over £10,000 in today's money. Pero was about 12 years old. Pero would become John Pinney's personal servant. For the next 3 decades, he would serve Pinney, first on Nevis, then in England. His story would become inseparable from Pinney's. And today, a bridge in Bristol bears his name. By 1772, Pinney's plantation operations had expanded considerably. Mount Traverse plantation covered 394 acres. Between 170 and 210 enslaved people lived and worked there. They produced on average about 110 hogsheads of sugar, roughly 30,000 kilograms, and around 7,250 gallons of rum each year. The work was brutal. Field laborers cleared land, planted cane, harvested it with machetes under the tropical sun. The processing work in the boiling house was dangerous. Workers faced burns from the vats of boiling cane juice. The conditions were grueling, the hours long, the living quarters cramped. The plantations of Nevis operated through violence and the threat of violence. Pinney's estate records mention various punishments. Some managers used clogs, large wooden blocks chained to an ankle that people had to drag around while working. Others used iron collars armed with spikes. Runaways were hunted down with dogs and brought back for punishment. Persistent escape attempts could result in being sold away from family, shipped to another island where you knew no one. Pinney himself oversaw this system. He wrote detailed letters to his managers, giving instructions on plantation operations, discussing the purchase of new workers, calculating profits and losses. In 1772, Pinney married Jane Weeks, a white Creole woman, meaning she was born in the Caribbean to European parents. Together they would have 7 children. John Frederick, born on Nevis in March 1773. Elizabeth, born the January 1774. Azariah, born the January 1775. Alicia, born December 1776. Pretor, born May 1781. Mary, born in Bristol in September 1786. And Charles, born in Bristol in April 1793. The older children were born on Nevis, growing up on the plantation, witnessing daily the system of slavery that funded their comfortable lives. The younger children would be born in England, beneficiaries of wealth extracted from the Caribbean, but spatially removed from its source. The 1770s and early 1780s brought significant challenges to Nevis planters. In 1772, a devastating hurricane struck the island, destroying Pinney's sugar works and wiping out slave housing, leaving people homeless. Famine threatened. The following year brought smallpox. Then the American Revolutionary War disrupted trade routes. Nevis had relied on imports from North America for provisions to feed enslaved workers. With those supply lines cut, starvation stalked the island. Pinney survived these crises through careful management and ruthless efficiency. He developed provision grounds where enslaved people grew their own food, meaning they worked their own plots after completing their regular labor. He invested in livestock. He wrote extensively about these adaptations, framing them as prudent business decisions. By 1783, after 19 years on Nevis, John Pinney was ready to return to England. He had accomplished what he'd set out to do. He'd turned his inherited, debt-ridden estates into profitable enterprises. His personal fortune had grown to about £70,000, an enormous sum that would give him entry into England's upper class. When Pinney sailed back to England, he took two people with him, Frances Coker and Pero Jones. Frances, also called Fanny, was a mixed-race woman who had been born on Pinney's plantation. She had been Jane Pinney's servant on Nevis. At the age of 11, Frances had been given her freedom. She now served as lady's maid to Jane Pinney, but as a free woman. Pero Jones had a different status. Despite 32 years of service to John Pinney, despite traveling with the family to England, Pero was never freed. He remained enslaved until his death. Pero had been trained as a barber. On Nevis, he was often entrusted with carrying large amounts of cash. He clearly held Pinney's confidence, but confidence didn't translate to freedom. In 1783, the Pinney family initially settled in Bristol at Park Street. Then, between 1789 and 1791, John Pinney commissioned the construction of an elegant townhouse at 7 Great George Street, in the fashionable Clifton area. The house was possibly designed by William Patty of Bristol, a prominent architect and marble mason. It featured 6 stories, elegant Georgian proportions, and all the amenities expected in a gentleman's residence. The house had separate quarters for servants. It had a cold water plunge pool. It had elegant reception rooms for entertaining. And it had a study where John Pinney would conduct his new business ventures. Pero Jones lived and worked in that house. He slept in the servants' quarters. He attended to Pinney's personal needs. He moved through the same spaces as the Pinney children, serving the family that owned him. Bristol, in the 1780s, was one of England's major ports, heavily involved in the triangular trade. Ships left Bristol carrying manufactured goods to Africa, where they were traded for enslaved people. Those enslaved people were transported across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. The ships returned to Bristol laden with sugar, rum, tobacco, and other goods produced by enslaved labor. But by the time Pinney returned, Bristol's direct involvement in the slave trade was declining. The peak had passed. Of greater importance now was the West India trade, supplying plantations with goods and importing sugar for Bristol's growing refining industry. Pinney positioned himself perfectly for this trade. He went into partnership with James Tobin, another Nevis plantation owner who had relocated to Bristol. Tobin was an active pro-slavery campaigner who would become a national spokesman defending slavery against the growing abolitionist movement. The firm of Pinney and Tobin operated from Pinney's house, probably using his study as an office. Over the years, they were involved with at least 10 different ships. These vessels traded between the Caribbean and England, importing sugar to Bristol and exporting plantation supplies, tools, machinery, building materials, food, clothing. But Pinney and Tobin didn't just trade sugar. They also acted as factors, agents for other plantation owners. They sold sugar on behalf of clients. They arranged for supplies to be sent to plantations. And, crucially, they loaned money to plantation owners who needed capital to cover bad harvests, pay debts, or expand operations. This lending business was where Pinney made most of his fortune in England. The interest charged was substantial, and when debtors couldn't repay, Pinney and Tobin took over their plantations and the enslaved people on them. Through debt, Pinney expanded his holdings without having to travel back to the Caribbean. Pinney remained an absentee owner of Mount Revers, managing the plantation through correspondence with his on-site managers. The University of Bristol Library holds these letters, detailed instructions about planting, harvesting, slave purchases, punishments, provisions. The letters reveal a man intensely focused on profit maximization, viewing the plantation as an investment to be carefully managed from 3,000 miles away. In 1786, Pinney joined the Bristol West India Association, an organization founded explicitly to lobby against the abolitionist movement. As the anti-slavery campaign gained momentum, plantation owners and merchants organized to defend their interests. They argued that slavery was essential to British wealth, that enslaved people were better off than European poor, that abolition would cause economic catastrophe. James Tobin became one of the most prominent voices in this campaign. He wrote pamphlets attacking abolitionists, particularly Reverend James Ramsey, a former naval chaplain who had witnessed slavery's horrors firsthand in the Caribbean. Tobin claimed, "I have no doubt that the situation of the West India slaves is preferable to that of the laboring poor in Europe." This was a common argument. Enslaved people received housing, food, and clothing, pro-slavery advocates claimed. European poor had to pay for everything from low wages. Tobin even cited the Caribbean's better weather as a benefit to enslaved people, as if pleasant climate compensated for being property, for having no freedom, for being subject to sale, punishment, and forced labor. Pinney supported these arguments, but privately he expressed concern. In February 1788, he wrote to his agent William Coker on Nevis, "The present alarming crisis respecting the abolition of the African trade operates so strongly on my mind that I think seriously of selling my estate and slaves." It wasn't moral qualms driving this consideration. It was financial anxiety. Pinney worried that abolition might hurt property values, make plantations less profitable, disrupt the whole system that had made him wealthy. But he didn't sell. Not yet. The abolitionist campaign would take decades to succeed. For now, Pinney could continue profiting. Between 1783 and his death in 1818, Pinney's wealth grew from £70,000 to £340,000, a five-fold increase. Much of this came from interest on loans, from taking over plantations when debtors defaulted, from the steady flow of sugar profits from Nevis. His careful management and strategic position in Bristol's merchant community allowed him to accumulate wealth far beyond what the plantations alone would have generated. While Pinney built his fortune in Bristol, Pero Jones remained enslaved. Perrault visited Nevis in 1790 with Francis Coker, then again by himself in 1794. Something happened during that second visit. After returning to Bristol, Perrault's behavior changed. According to Pinney, Perrault began drinking heavily. His conduct became unacceptable. What happened during that 1794 visit to Nevis? Did Perrault see family members he'd been separated from? Did he witness something that shattered whatever accommodation he'd made with his enslavement? Did he realize that in England he was legally free, that slavery was not recognized under English law, but that Pinney kept him in bondage anyway? We don't know. The historical record preserves Pinney's complaints about Perrault's behavior. It doesn't preserve Perrault's voice, his thoughts, his experience of those final years. Perrault Jones died in 1798, at approximately 45 years old. He had served John Pinney for 32 years. There's no record that he was ever freed. He died as property. Today, a footbridge across Bristol's floating harbor bears his name, Perrault's Bridge. Opened in 1999, the bridge was designed by Irish artist Eilis O'Connell. Its distinctive horn-shaped counterweights help raise the central section for passing boats. The bridge serves as a memorial to Perrault Jones and to all enslaved Africans whose labor enriched Bristol merchants. Frances Coker lived much longer. She remained in Bristol after Perrault's death, living as a free woman. She died in 1820 and was buried in the Baptist Cemetery in Red Cross Street. Meanwhile, on Nevis, life on Mount Revere's plantation continued under Pinney's absentee ownership. The correspondence between Pinney and his managers reveals the day-to-day realities. Enslaved people worked from dawn to dusk during harvest season. Children as young as 6 or 7 were assigned light tasks. Teenagers worked in the fields alongside adults. Skilled workers, carpenters, coopers, blacksmiths, had somewhat better conditions but were no less enslaved. Resistance took many forms. Some people ran away, seeking freedom in Nevis's mountainous interior or trying to reach other islands. Others worked slowly, feigned illness, damaged equipment, stole from plantation stores. Each act of resistance carried risk of severe punishment, but people resisted anyway. In 1807, after decades of campaigning, abolitionists achieved a major victory. Parliament passed the Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. It was now illegal to purchase, transport, and sell enslaved people from Africa to British colonies. The transatlantic slave trade, at least Britain's participation in it, was over. But slavery itself remained legal. The approximately 1 million people already enslaved in British colonies remained in bondage. Plantation owners could still buy, sell, and hold the people they claimed as property. They just couldn't legally import new people from Africa. For men like John Pinney, this created a new problem. Caribbean plantations had horrific mortality rates. Death rates exceeded birth rates among enslaved populations. Continuous importation of new workers had sustained the system. Without that supply, plantation owners would have to rely on natural population increase, which meant treating enslaved people better, at least enough to keep them alive and reproducing. In 1808, the year after abolition of the slave trade, John Pinney decided to sell Mount Revere's. His main estate, the property his family had owned for over a century, would change hands. A Nevis neighbor named Edward Huggins expressed interest in buying. Pinney didn't want to sell to Huggins. Edward Huggins had a reputation for cruelty. His enslaved workers hated him so intensely that they had reportedly tried to kill him 5 times. But when another potential buyer withdrew, Pinney sold to Huggins anyway. The sale price was £35,650, about £1.75 million in today's money. The 183 enslaved people on the plantation were valued at £65 each, approximately £3,250 today. They were listed in the sale documents alongside livestock and equipment, inventoried as property. Those 183 people didn't choose their new owner. They had no say in the transaction, and they knew what kind of man Edward Huggins was. In 1810, they rebelled. The historical record doesn't detail what form the rebellion took, whether it was a work stoppage, a confrontation, an escape attempt, or something else. But Huggins's response was documented. He had 32 people publicly flogged. The punishments were extraordinary even by the brutal standards of Caribbean slavery. An eyewitness reported that one man received 365 lashes, one for each day of the year. A woman named Fanny received 291 lashes. Fanny died a few months later, whether directly from the flogging or from complications afterward. Edward Huggins was brought to trial for cruelty. The trial took place on Nevis before a jury of white plantation owners, men who had the same economic interests as Huggins, who owned enslaved people themselves. The verdict was predictable, not guilty. But the trial was reported in England. News of the floggings, of Fanny's death, of the mockery of justice in the acquittal caused public outrage. The case helped shift opinion in Britain. Even people who had been indifferent to slavery were horrified by the details. The Montrever's floggings became part of the abolitionist argument. This is what slavery looks like. This is what it means to treat human beings as property. John Pinney was insulated from the immediate consequences. He no longer owned Montrever's. He hadn't ordered the floggings, but he had sold 183 people to a man he knew was cruel. He had weighed their well-being against the convenience of completing the sale, and he had chosen profit. Pinney continued his business operations in Bristol. The firm of Pinney and Tobin remained profitable. His investments grew. He lived comfortably in his Georgian townhouse, a respected member of Bristol society. On January 23, 1818, John Pinney died. He was 77 years old. He was buried in the family vault in the parish church at Somerton in Somerset, not far from where he'd been born as John Preter. His estate was valued at £340,000, equivalent to about £24.5 million in 2019. He left behind his widow Jane and their surviving children. His son Charles took over much of the business. Another son, John Frederick, remained involved in managing the family's remaining Caribbean interests. Pinney's death came just 16 years before a reckoning that would reshape the British Empire. In 1833, Parliament finally passed the Slavery Abolition Act. Slavery throughout most of the British Empire was now illegal. But there was a twisted coda. The British government decided that slaveholders needed to be compensated for their loss of property. They established a fund of £20 million, equivalent to billions today, to pay compensation to slave owners. The enslaved people received nothing. The people who had been held in bondage, who had worked without pay for generations, who had built the wealth of the empire with their forced labor, they received no compensation. John Pinney's sons, Charles and John Frederick, received £23,210 in compensation for 1,220 enslaved people. This was for plantations the family still owned or had interests in across the Caribbean. The Pinney family, already wealthy from over a century of slavery, received additional payment from the British taxpayer for the inconvenience of having to free their human property. This money came from British taxes. Working-class Britons, including the very poor whose miserable condition had been used to justify slavery, helped pay compensation to slaveholders. The debt wasn't fully paid off until 2015. The enslaved people faced freedom without resources. They had no land, no capital, no accumulated wealth. Generations of their labor had enriched others. They started freedom with nothing. Today, John Pinney's Bristol townhouse at 7 Great George Street is the Georgian House Museum. You can walk through its elegant rooms, see the plunge pool, admire the architecture. Information panels tell the story of the Pinney family and their involvement in slavery. A room on the second floor features the names of over 900 enslaved people known to have lived on Mount Rover's plantation between 1680 and 1834. The names were compiled through painstaking archival research by historian Christine Eichelman. She worked through plantation records, slave lists, estate inventories, documents that treated people as property, but nevertheless recorded their existence. Now, those names are displayed, a memorial to people whose lives were documented only in the context of their enslavement. Pero Jones's name is there. So is Fanny's, the woman who died after Edward Huggins's brutal flogging. Nancy and Sheba, Pero's sisters, appear in the records. So do hundreds of others. Men, women, and children whose labor produced sugar, who endured conditions designed to extract maximum work, who resisted when they could, who somehow maintained humanity and community in circumstances designed to strip those away. Pero's Bridge stands as a memorial. The Georgian House Museum now openly confronts its connection to slavery rather than celebrating only Georgian elegance. Bristol has begun reckoning with its past, acknowledging the source of much of its historic wealth. But questions remain. How do we understand men like John Pinney? He wasn't exceptional in his cruelty. Many planters were worse. He expressed shock at his first slave auction. He seems to have believed he treated enslaved people better than other owners did. Some historians have noted that he understood that better treatment produced more profit. So his relative moderation was itself economically motivated. But he bought children. He separated families when it suited his interests. He sold people to a man he knew was brutal. He kept Pero Jones enslaved for 32 years, never freeing him even in England where slavery wasn't legally recognized. He joined organizations explicitly created to defend slavery against abolition. He profited continuously from a system built on human bondage. Pinney's religious justification, that God would have given a sign if slavery were wrong, reveals the moral gymnastics required to maintain the system. He needed to believe slavery was divinely ordained because the alternative was unbearable, that he was complicit in enormous evil for personal profit. The wealth Pinney accumulated didn't disappear with his death. It flowed to his children, funded their education, established them in society. His son Charles continued the family business. The compensation money in 1833 added to family assets. The Georgian house and other properties represented stored wealth that could be passed down. The enslaved people's labor created this wealth, but their descendants inherited none of it. They inherited poverty, social disadvantage, and the ongoing effects of generational trauma. John Pinney's story illustrates how slavery functioned in the British Atlantic world. He wasn't a ship captain or slave trader, the roles we sometimes focus on when discussing the slave trade. He was a plantation owner and merchant, operating largely within legal frameworks, respected in his community, justified by religious and economic arguments that his society largely accepted. He represents a more common and perhaps more important category, the ordinary beneficiary of slavery. Not the exceptionally cruel outliers, but the businessmen who treated slavery as normal commerce, who managed plantations as investments, who built fortunes through careful calculation of profit and loss with human beings on the ledger. Understanding Pinney's story means understanding how the system worked, how it was justified, how it enriched certain people and regions while devastating others. The elegant Georgian architecture of Bristol stands as testimony to wealth extracted from Caribbean plantations. The sugar that sweetened British tea, the rum that filled British glasses, the profits that built British fortunes, all came at incalculable human cost. Pero Jones served John Pinney for 32 years. He lived in the Georgian house. He walked Bristol's streets. He crossed the Atlantic multiple times. He watched Pinney grow wealthier year by year. And he died enslaved. His freedom never granted, his service never compensated. Fanny received 291 lashes and died. Nancy and Sheba's fates are unknown. The 900 people whose names now appear in the Georgian House Museum endured lives we can only glimpse through fragments in plantation records. John Pinney died wealthy and respected. His townhouse remains elegant. His business acumen is documented. His letters are preserved in archives. But the real cost of his fortune is measured in lives, in childhood stolen, in families separated, in bodies broken by labor, in potential never realized because people were forced into slavery's brutal machinery. The story of John Pinney and Pero Jones, of the Mount Revers plantation and the Georgian house, of sugar wealth and slavery's violence. This story matters because its legacies persist. The wealth accumulated through slavery-funded institutions created advantages that compounded over generations, established patterns of inequality that haven't disappeared. Pero's Bridge reminds us. The names in the museum remind us. The careful documentation of historical truth reminds us. John Pinney believed God ordained slavery. He was wrong. What God ordained, or what human conscience demands, is remembering that the 900 people on those plantation lists were not property. They were people, and their lives, their labor, their suffering, and their resistance are as much a part of the story as the Georgian elegance that their work made possible. The gentlemen in the Georgian house profited from their bondage. Today, we have a responsibility to remember both parts of that story, the wealth created and the human cost that created it.